was one of those rare, radiant April afternoons when the English countryside seems to exist for the sheer pleasure of being admired. In the village of Wickham Common, hedgerows shimmered with new green, primroses starred the lanes, and the lawns of Hazeldown, the stately home of Mrs. Eleanor Whitstable, had been rolled to billiard-table perfection for the annual Easter garden party. The event was as much a tradition as the church bells themselves, drawing every villager, from the vicar's wife to the humblest gardener, into its orbit of simnel cake, bonnet competitions, and genteel rivalry. Mrs. Whitstable, a woman of formidable energy and even more formidable expectations, surveyed her realm with a proprietary air. Her son Julian, handsome, if a touch too aware of it, hovered at her side, his attention divided between the guests and the possibility of some private mischief. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Penfold, bustled about, organizing games and prizes, while Dr. Lionel Aldridge lent a tolerant ear to advice on the proper arrangement of marzipan balls atop the simnel cake. Among the guests was Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Emmeline Hart. Miss Marple, unassuming in her pale blue cardigan and sensible shoes, presided over the mystery parcels stall beneath a spreading copper beech. Her hands busied themselves with parcels and string, but her pale eyes missed nothing. The anxious child hovering near the sweets, the way Mrs. Whitstable's housekeeper, Mrs. Vale, glanced at her employer with lips pressed thin, the subtle shift in the gardener Tom Pritchard's stance as he avoided the main walk, preferring the safety of the yew-bordered path. There was, as always, an undercurrent beneath the surface gaiety. Mrs. Whitstable's reputation as the village's benefactress was unassailable, but even the most generous of hostesses was not without her critics or rivals. The arrival of Mr. Conrad Fielding, a London journalist, had set tongues wagging. Was he there to praise Wickham Common's traditions or to unearth some long-buried scandal? And what of Miss Iris Blake, the quiet school-teacher whose watchful gaze suggested she saw more than she said? Old resentments and new ambitions mingled with the scent of hyacinths and lemon drizzle cake. The party reached its peak with the judging of the Easter bonnets, a matter of pride and, for some, subtle warfare. Mrs. Whitstable, poised atop the dais, delivered her speech with practiced charm, her amethyst beads catching the afternoon sun. "Tradition," she declared, "is not just what we keep, but what keeps us kind." As she spoke, Mr. Pettigrew, the chemist, brought forth a barrow of sugared almonds in cones tied with ribbon, blue for the ladies, pink for the gentlemen. Mrs. Whitstable accepted a blue-tied cone, loosened the ribbon, and, with a theatrical flourish, placed an almond on her tongue. The silence that followed was not the hush of polite attention, but something sharper, a crack in the afternoon's seamless fabric. Mrs. Whitstable's hand flew to her throat. Her face blanched, eyes wide with shock. Dr. Aldridge rushed forward, but it was too late. The cone slipped from her grasp, scattering white almonds onto the grass. A faint, bitter scent lingered in the air. Panic rippled through the crowd. Julian called out, his voice breaking with disbelief. The spaniels whined and pressed close. Miss Penfold snatched a child away from the fallen almonds. Inspector Merriweather, summoned from the lane, took charge, his presence a small comfort amidst the rising fear. Miss Marple, quiet and composed, observed it all, the mismatched ribbon tied around the fatal cone, the glass with its faint, unfamiliar scent, the way Mrs. Whitstable's amethyst beads lay crooked against her collarbone. She noted, too, the expressions of the guests. Shock, yes, but also something deeper. Suppressed relief in some, panic in others, calculation in more than one pair of eyes. As the first uncertain questions swept the lawn, was it a seizure? An accident? Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, sifting through the detritus of gossip and observation. She thought of sugared almonds at christenings, of the way people reveal themselves in moments of crisis, and of how, in villages, secrets are always buried just beneath the spring grass. "Emmeline," she murmured as her friend hovered anxiously, "would you be so good as to fetch me the blue wool from the house? I believe I may have use for it before long." And as the church clock chimed the quarter hour, Wickham Common found itself, for the first time in living memory, utterly at a loss. The silence that followed was not the respectful hush of grief, but something sharper, the breathless quiet of a village suddenly aware that death had walked among them in broad daylight. Dr. Aldridge rose from beside Mrs. Whitstable's still form, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped them with a handkerchief that would never seem quite clean again. His face, usually so composed in the presence of human frailty, bore the unmistakable pallor of a man who had encountered something beyond the natural order of things. "Inspector," he said quietly to Merryweather, who had materialized with the swift efficiency of authority summoned by crisis, "I'm afraid there can be no doubt. The symptoms, the rapidity of onset, that distinctive scent. Cyanide poisoning. Someone has deliberately murdered Mrs. Whitstable." The word "murdered" fell among the assembled guests like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the crowd. Several ladies gasped audibly, and Mrs. Penfold instinctively drew closer to her husband, her earlier organizational efficiency replaced by the rigid posture of someone trying very hard not to lose composure entirely. Inspector Merryweather, a solid man in his 50s, more accustomed to settling disputes over boundary hedges than investigating homicide, surveyed the scene with the methodical attention of someone who understood that in such moments every detail mattered. "No one is to leave the grounds," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "This garden party has become a crime scene, and I shall need to speak with each of you." Miss Marple, who had remained quietly beside her mystery parcel stall throughout the unfolding drama, now moved with the unhurried purpose of someone who understood the importance of preserving evidence. From her handbag, she withdrew the ball of blue wool that Emmeline had faithfully retrieved, and with movements both gentle and deliberate, she began to create a loose boundary around the scattered almonds and the fallen cone. "There now," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone watching. "How very important not to disturb things until they can be properly examined." Her pale eyes took in every detail within that improvised circle. The way the sugar coating had cracked on several almonds, revealing the innocent nuts within, and most particularly, the ribbon that had tied the fatal cone. It was blue, certainly, but not the soft sky blue that adorned the other cones still sitting primly on Mr. Pettigrew's barrow. This ribbon was darker, with a duller sheen, and the knot was tied differently, flat and firm rather than the puffy bows so beloved of parish room volunteers. Julian Whitstable knelt beside his mother's body, his handsome features slack with disbelief. "This cannot be happening," he whispered, then louder, his voice cracking with rising panic. "Mother! Mother!" The cry tore through the afternoon air, raw and desperate, causing several guests to instinctively move toward him before remembering the inspector's instructions to maintain their distance. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper whose competent management had made the afternoon's festivities possible, stood frozen near the patio doors, her face drained of all color. Her hands, usually so steady in their work, pressed against her mouth as if to hold back words that threatened to spill forth. When Mrs. Penfold approached with gentle concern, offering a steadying arm, Mrs. Vale shook her head violently. "I should have known," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet air. "I should have seen it coming. The letters, the telephone calls. She'd been so worried lately, so unlike herself. Just this morning she said—" Her voice broke entirely, and she began to weep with the desperate intensity of someone whose careful world had suddenly collapsed. "What letters?" Inspector Merryweather asked sharply, his attention immediately focused on this first concrete clue. But Mrs. Vale had dissolved into tears, her composure finally cracking under the weight of shock and what appeared to be guilt. Mr. Pettigrew, the chemist, stood beside his barrow of almond cones like a man witnessing his life's work transformed into an instrument of death. His face had gone ashen, and he kept glancing at the remaining cones as if they might suddenly reveal their secrets, or, worse, prove equally lethal. "It cannot be the almonds," he said, his voice high with strain. "I prepared them myself this very morning. Fresh sugar, fresh nuts. I've been making them the same way for 15 years. Yet someone has used your almonds to commit murder," Inspector Merriweather observed. "Not unkindly, but with the directness necessary to cut through shock and reach truth. I shall need to know exactly how they were prepared, who had access to them, and when." Miss Blake, the school teacher, had been standing quietly near a group of her pupils, her dark eyes moving from face to face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every expression, every gesture. Now she spoke for the first time since the tragedy had unfolded. "The ribbons," she said clearly, her teacher's voice cutting through the murmur of distressed conversation. "We tied them last evening in the parish room, Mrs. Penfold, Martha Pike, and myself. All blue for the ladies, all pink for the gentlemen. But that ribbon," she gestured toward Miss Marple's wool boundary, "that's not the same blue we used." Conrad Fielding, the London journalist, whose presence had already stirred curiosity among the villagers, had produced a small notebook and was writing with what seemed like unseemly haste. While others recoiled from the scene in horror, he leaned forward slightly, observing with the professional detachment of someone accustomed to finding stories in human tragedy. "A fascinating case," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Murder at a village Easter party. The irony is almost literary." His eyes moved from Julian's grief-stricken face to the scattered evidence, then to the closed expression of Mrs. Vale, cataloguing details with an efficiency that struck several observers as distinctly ghoulish. "Mr. Fielding," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the particular tone elderly ladies use when addressing young men whose behavior requires correction. "You mentioned earlier that you came to write about village traditions. How fortunate for your article that you should witness such an unusual tradition." Fielding's pen paused for just a moment, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of something, calculation, perhaps, or wariness, that crossed his features before his practiced smile returned. "Indeed, Miss Marple, isn't it? Though I hardly think murder qualifies as a tradition, even in the most colorful English villages." "Oh, but you might be surprised," Miss Marple replied with the mild interest of someone discussing the weather. "Villages have such long memories, and sometimes old grievances have a way of blossoming at the most unexpected moments." Tom Pritchard, the gardener, had retreated to the shadow of a large rhododendron bush, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. Unlike the other guests who clustered together seeking comfort in shared shock, he stood apart, his gaze fixed not on Mrs. Whitstable's body, but on something beyond the immediate scene. When Inspector Merriweather's eyes fell upon him, Tom's shoulders tensed as if preparing for flight, though his feet remained firmly planted. "The will," Julian said suddenly, his voice stronger now, though still edged with grief. "Inspector, I should speak to you about Mother's will. There are circumstances you should know about." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. In villages, the mention of wills in connection with sudden death carries particular weight, and several guests exchanged meaningful glances. Mrs. Dacre, a woman with 4 daughters and therefore considerable experience in reading human nature, whispered to her neighbor, "Always the will, isn't it? Young Mr. Julian may be charming, but one hears things about London debts." "Not him," Tom Pritchard said unexpectedly, his voice carrying from his position by the rhododendron with surprising certainty. "He may be feckless, but he ain't cold enough for this." "Coldness isn't always required," Fielding observed mildly, his pen still moving across his notebook. "Desperation can drive people to remarkable extremes." Miss Blake turned toward the journalist with a look of quiet disapproval. Mr. Fielding, you don't know us. Please don't pretend that you do." Her voice carried a teacher's authority, but Miss Marple noticed something else. The way Miss Blake's gaze had followed Mrs. Vale when the housekeeper hurried toward the house, and the worry that flickered in those dark eyes suggested knowledge of secrets that ran deeper than the afternoon's tragedy. As the shadows began to lengthen across the lawn and the first chill of evening touched the air, Inspector Merriweather organized his constables to begin the careful work of preserving evidence and taking preliminary statements. The garden party, which had begun as a celebration of spring and community, had transformed into something far more sinister, a locked-room mystery played out on an English lawn, where every guest was now a potential suspect and every innocent detail might conceal a clue. Miss Marple wound her blue wool back into a neat ball, her movements unhurried despite the gravity of the situation. She had seen enough of human nature to know that the truth, when it finally emerged, would likely prove more complex than anyone currently imagined. The scattered almonds gleamed like small accusations in the fading light, and somewhere among the shocked faces and carefully controlled expressions around her, a murderer waited to see whether their carefully laid plan would succeed. "Emmeline," she said quietly to her friend, who hovered anxiously nearby, "I believe we shall be staying in Wickham Common rather longer than we originally planned. Such a pity about the Easter celebrations, but then again, human nature does have a way of asserting itself at the most inconvenient moments." As the golden afternoon light began to fade into the softer hues of early evening, Inspector Merriweather took charge of the scene with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that in cases of murder, the first hours were crucial. The guests were gently but firmly guided from the lawn into Hazeldown's spacious drawing-room, where the familiar comfort of chintz-covered furniture and family portraits seemed oddly at variance with the gravity of the situation. Dr. Aldridge completed his preliminary examination with professional thoroughness, his usual bedside manner replaced by the crisp precision required when death had come, calling uninvited. "Inspector," he said quietly, drawing Merriweather aside, "I can confirm that this was indeed cyanide poisoning. The rapidity of onset, the distinctive scent, there's no question. Someone has committed a deliberate act of murder." The word fell among the assembled villagers like a stone cast into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the crowd. Mrs. Penfold instinctively moved closer to her husband, while several of the ladies reached for their handkerchiefs. The children, sensing the adult anxiety without understanding its cause, pressed closer to their mothers with the intuitive wisdom of the young. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her position near the French doors, now moved with the unhurried purpose of someone who understood the importance of preserving details before they could be disturbed or forgotten. She had noticed, during the initial confusion, several small but potentially significant items scattered near where Mrs. Whitstable had fallen. Items that might tell their own story if examined with sufficient care. "Mrs. Vale," Inspector Merriweather said gently, addressing the housekeeper who stood wringing her hands near the doorway, "you mentioned earlier that Mrs. Whitstable had been receiving some troubling correspondence. I shall need to know more about that." The older woman's composure, which had held admirably through the initial crisis, now began to crack under the weight of official questioning. "Oh, Inspector, I don't know what to think. There were letters, nasty, anonymous things, arriving over the past fortnight. Mrs. Whitstable tried to hide her distress, but I could see how they affected her, and the telephone calls, twice this very morning, hanging up when I answered." "What sort of things were said in these letters?" Mrs. Vale glanced around the room at the watching faces, clearly reluctant to speak ill of her deceased employer. I couldn't say exactly, sir. Mrs. Whitstable never showed them to me directly. But I heard her speaking to someone on the telephone yesterday, telling them that the past was past and that she wouldn't be intimidated by threats or insinuations. This revelation sent a fresh murmur through the assembled guests. The suggestion of Blackmail added an entirely new dimension to the crime, transforming what might have been a simple matter of inheritance into something far more complex and sinister. Mr. Pettigrew, the chemist, had been growing increasingly pale throughout these proceedings. When Inspector Merryweather's attention turned to him, he seemed to shrink into himself. "Inspector, I must tell you about the almonds. I prepared them this morning, as I have for 15 years. Fresh sugar syrup, careful dipping, proper storage. But there was a period when they were left unattended." "How long and where?" "Perhaps 5 or 6 minutes in the service pantry. Martha Pike and I had brought them over at 11:30, but we needed to find Mrs. Vale to ask where she wanted them placed. We left the barrow briefly while we located her." Martha Pike, Mr. Pettigrew's young assistant, nodded nervously. "It's true, Inspector. We were only gone a few minutes, but anyone who knew where we'd left them could have interfered with the contents." Miss Marple, who had been listening to these exchanges with the quiet attention of someone assembling pieces of a complex puzzle, now spoke for the first time since the questioning began. "Mr. Pettigrew, when you prepared the almonds, did you tie the ribbons yourself?" "No, miss. That was done yesterday evening in the parish room by the ladies. Mrs. Penfold, Miss Blake, and young Martha here. All blue ribbons for the ladies' cones, all tied with proper bows." Miss Blake, who had been standing quietly near the mantelpiece, now stepped forward slightly. "That's correct. We were very particular about using the same shade of ribbon throughout. A lovely Wedgwood blue that Mrs. Whitstable had specially ordered. But the ribbon on her cone—" She paused, her teacher's eye for detail coming to the fore. "That wasn't the same blue we used. It was darker, duller somehow, and tied with a flat knot rather than a bow." The significance of this observation was not lost on Inspector Merryweather, who made careful notes. "So someone substituted a different cone, or at least retied one with different ribbon. That suggests considerable premeditation." Julian Whitstable, who had been sitting in stunned silence since the questioning began, now looked up with hollow eyes. "Inspector, there's something else you should know. About my mother's will." His voice carried clearly in the hushed room, and several guests leaned forward despite themselves. "She changed it recently. Last month, in fact. She was disappointed in my recent behavior. Some debts, some poor choices. She had decided to reduce my inheritance significantly." A collective intake of breath greeted this revelation. In villages, the mention of wills in connection with sudden death carries particular weight, and Miss Marple noticed several meaningful glances exchanged among the guests. "The bulk of the estate was to go to various charities," Julian continued with bitter resignation, "with provisions for the household staff. Mrs. Vale, in particular, was to receive a substantial bequest." Mrs. Vale turned even paler, if such a thing were possible. "Mr. Julian, you mustn't think I never knew. Mrs. Whitstable never told me of any such thing." Tom Pritchard, who had been standing silently near the garden doors throughout the proceedings, now spoke for the first time. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but if you're looking for someone with reason to wish Mrs. Whitstable ill, you might cast your net wider than the immediate household." "What do you mean by that, Mr. Pritchard?" The gardener's weathered face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a glint of something that might have been long-suppressed resentment. Mrs. Whitstable was a generous lady in her way, but she had strong opinions about right and wrong. There's more than one person in this village who's felt the sharp side of her tongue when she disapproved of their conduct. Conrad Fielding, the London journalist who had been observing the proceedings with professional interest, now looked up from his notebook. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Pritchard, that Mrs. Whitstable had enemies beyond her immediate circle?" "I'm suggesting," Tom replied carefully, "that a woman who makes it her business to know everyone else's affairs sometimes learns things that certain people would prefer to keep hidden." As the shadows lengthened outside the windows and the first chill of evening touched the air, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest. Someone in this room was a murderer, someone who had planned and executed a remarkably sophisticated crime. The substituted cone, the threatening letters, the complex web of motives involving inheritance, blackmail, and village secrets all pointed to a killer who was both methodical and desperate. Later that evening, as the guests finally dispersed to their homes with strict instructions to remain available for further questioning, Miss Marple walked slowly through the service areas of Hazeldown with Emmeline Hart. In the small pantry, where the fatal barrow had been briefly left unattended, she paused to examine the narrow space with particular attention. "Do you see, Emmeline?" she said quietly, pointing to a small fragment of almond coating on the floor near the threshold. "Someone stood here, working quickly but carefully, and there," she indicated a length of dark blue ribbon lying forgotten on a shelf. The wrong ribbon, discarded after the substitution was made. Emmeline peered at these seemingly insignificant details with the bewilderment of someone who saw only debris. "Jane, you always notice things that escape the rest of us entirely." "But what does it all mean?" Miss Marple wound her ball of wool thoughtfully. "It means, my dear, that our murderer is someone who thinks very carefully about details, except when pressed for time. The substitution was cleverly planned, but the execution left traces, and those traces, I believe, will eventually tell us everything we need to know about who killed poor Mrs. Whitstable, and why." As they walked back through the darkened garden, past the chalk outlines and police markers that had transformed the peaceful lawn into a crime scene, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of village life. Beneath the surface of tea parties and garden fetes, human passions ran as deep and dangerous as anywhere else. Someone had used the innocent ritual of an Easter celebration to commit murder, and tomorrow, in the clear light of a new day, the careful work of unraveling their deception would begin in earnest. The church clock struck 9 as they reached the garden gate, and somewhere in the darkness, a murderer was probably lying awake, wondering whether their carefully laid plans would prove sufficient to escape the consequences of their deadly act. The morning following the tragedy dawned with that particular quality of light that sometimes follows great disturbances, clear and somehow expectant, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and from the window of Emmeline Hart's cottage she could observe the subtle changes that murder had wrought upon the peaceful rhythms of Wickham Common. The postman lingered longer at each gate. The baker's customers clustered in hushed conversation, and even the vicar's morning constitutional had slowed to accommodate the grave exchanges that seemed to spring up at every corner. Inspector Merriweather arrived at Hazeldown just after 8 o'clock, his solid figure moving with the methodical purpose of a man who understood that in cases of murder, the first 24 hours often determined whether justice would be served. Dr. Aldridge had completed his preliminary examination and departed, leaving behind a small collection of evidence that would be sent to the county analyst, though his parting words to the inspector had been grimly definitive. "Cyanide poisoning, without question," he had said, tugging on his gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to dealing with the darker aspects of human nature. The symptoms, the rapidity of onset, that unmistakable bitter almond scent. There can be no doubt. Someone has committed deliberate murder. The inspector began his more detailed investigation with the practical matter of tracing the poison itself. A visit to Mr. Pettigrew's shop revealed the expected entry in the poisons register, a small quantity of potassium cyanide tablets sold the previous summer for dealing with wasp nests at Hazeldown. The signature was neat and familiar, R. Vale, collected on behalf of the household. Mrs. Vale came in herself, Mr. Pettigrew explained, his hands fluttering nervously as he recalled the transaction. Said Mr. Pritchard needed something effective for the wasps near the south wall. Nasty business, wasp nests. You need something that works quickly. When summoned, Mrs. Vale confirmed the purchase with the weary resignation of someone whose careful world had suddenly collapsed around her. Mr. Pritchard asked me to collect it when I was in the village anyway. Such a responsible man. He always insisted on proper precautions when dealing with dangerous substances. Tom Pritchard's weathered face remained carefully neutral when questioned about the remaining poison, but he readily led them to the potting shed where the tablets had been stored. The small building, redolent with the rich scents of earth and growing things, held an additional odor that Miss Marple's sensitive nose detected immediately, a faint but unmistakable bitter tang that lingered near the wooden shelves. There, Inspector Merryweather's careful search revealed telling evidence. A faint ring on the shelf where a small container had once stood, an empty paper twist bearing the chemist's purple stamp crushed behind a stack of seed trays, and, most significantly, a small teaspoon that, when examined closely, carried the ghost of that same bitter almond scent. "Any man who works with wasps will have that smell about him in summer," Tom said with an effort at a lightness that convinced no one. "Doesn't mean he'd go about poisoning ladies at garden parties." "No," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It certainly doesn't mean that." Back at the house, Inspector Merryweather's search for the threatening letters that Mrs. Vale had mentioned proved equally revealing, though in an unexpected way. Mrs. Whitstable's private sitting room, usually a model of orderly arrangement, showed subtle signs of recent disturbance. The escritoire drawer where the letters had supposedly been kept stood empty, its key missing from the small china dish where it was customarily stored. "She did keep them there," Mrs. Vale insisted, her composure finally beginning to crack under the strain. "This morning, when I went to—" She stopped herself abruptly, color rising in her cheeks as all eyes turned toward her. "When you went to fetch them before I asked," Inspector Merryweather finished gently. "Is that what you meant to say?" Miss Marple, who had been quietly examining the room with the thoroughness of someone who understood the importance of domestic details, now moved toward the chintz-covered chair beside the escritoire. With the casual movement of someone retrieving a dropped handkerchief, she lifted the seat cushion and revealed the missing key lying beneath it. "The drawer has been opened since last evening," the inspector observed, making careful notes, "by someone who knew where the key was usually kept, but in their haste left it in an unusual place." The investigation took on new urgency when Miss Blake arrived at the house, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. The school teacher's revelation about the ribbons provided a crucial piece of the puzzle that had been troubling Miss Marple since the previous evening. "When we were preparing the cones Wednesday evening," Miss Blake explained with characteristic precision, "we discovered that Mrs. Penfold's ribbon wasn't sufficient for all the cones. We had to supplement with ribbon from the church supplies, a slightly different shade, darker and with less sheen. In the lamplight of the parish room, the difference wasn't immediately apparent." "How many cones were tied with this second ribbon?" Miss Marple asked with gentle interest. "Only 3 or 4. We used it sparingly and placed those cones in the center of the barrow, where they would naturally be distributed last." Miss Blake paused, her teacher's eye for detail coming to the fore. "But Mrs. Whitstable received her cone quite early in the proceedings, which means someone deliberately selected one of the darker ribboned cones and repositioned it." This revelation was followed by Martha Pike's breathless arrival with additional information that cast the crime in an even more sinister light. The young woman's recollection of seeing a shadowy figure near the service entrance while she and Mr. Pettigrew were searching for Mrs. Vale provided crucial evidence about the timing of the substitution. "Just a glimpse, really," Martha explained, her face flushed with the importance of her testimony. "But whoever it was moved with confidence, as if they knew the house well. They didn't hesitate or look about as a stranger might. They avoided the main corridors and kept to the back passages." As the morning progressed and the investigation gathered momentum, the picture of a remarkably sophisticated crime began to emerge. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the garden party arrangements and Hazeldown's domestic geography had planned and executed what would have been the perfect murder, had they been more careful about concealing the evidence of their preparations. Meanwhile, throughout the village, the machinery of gossip had begun its inexorable work. At the post office, Mrs. Finch confirmed that there had been several mysterious telephone calls to Hazeldown over the past fortnight, calls that were terminated immediately when Mrs. Vale answered. At the village shop, theories multiplied like spring flowers, each more elaborate than the last. "Such a strong-minded woman, Mrs. Whitstable," observed Mrs. Ponsonby to anyone who would listen. "Always knew what was best for everyone. Some folks don't take kindly to being told what's what, if you take my meaning." Conrad Fielding, the London journalist, moved through these conversations with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources. His notebook filled with observations and theories, though Miss Marple noticed that his questions often seemed designed to direct suspicion toward particular individuals rather than simply gather facts. By noon, Inspector Merriweather had assembled a collection of evidence that painted a disturbing picture. The missing, threatening letters, the substituted ribbon, the residual traces of poison in the potting shed, and most troubling of all, the suggestion that Mrs. Whitstable had been deliberately lured away from the main party at a crucial moment. "Someone removed those letters," he confided to Miss Marple as they stood in the library where Mrs. Whitstable's family Bible lay open at the register of births and marriages. Someone who feared what they contained more after the murder than before it. Miss Marple considered this observation with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex piece of needlework. "There is a type of person, Inspector, who thinks only one step ahead. Such people may commit an irrevocable act, and then, when the consequences prove larger than expected, they scurry about trying to conceal what they should have considered beforehand. In my experience, it is not the most sophisticated criminals who remove incriminating evidence after the fact. It is ordinary people who are capable of panic." As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Hazeldown's lawn, where chalk marks and police barriers had transformed a scene of innocent celebration into something far more sinister, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of village life. Beneath the surface of tea parties and garden fetes, human passions ran as deep and dangerous as anywhere else. Someone had used the familiar rituals of community celebration to commit murder, and now, in the clear light of investigation, their carefully constructed deception was beginning to show its flaws. The church clock struck 2 as Inspector Merriweather prepared to begin his formal interviews with the principal suspects. Somewhere in Wickham Common, a murderer was going about the ordinary business of daily life, maintaining the facade of normalcy while wondering whether their elaborate plan would prove sufficient to escape the consequences of their deadly act. But Miss Marple, winding her ball of wool with characteristic patience, had already begun to see the pattern that would eventually lead to the truth. Inspector Merriweather established his headquarters in the library of Hazeldown, where the afternoon light fell across polished mahogany and leather-bound volumes that had witnessed generations of family conferences, but never proceedings quite so grave as these. The formal interviews began with the methodical precision of a man who understood that in cases of murder, every detail might prove crucial, and every evasion might conceal the truth. Julian Whitstable was summoned first, arriving with the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who had spent the night wrestling with grief and the uncomfortable awareness of his own suspicious circumstances. Despite his obvious distress, he answered questions with the careful precision of someone who understood that his recent financial difficulties cast him in an unfavorable light. "Inspector, I won't pretend that my relationship with my mother had been entirely harmonious. Recently," Julian admitted, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "There were debts, gambling debts primarily, and Mother had made her disappointment quite clear, but to suggest that I would murder her for money." His voice broke slightly, and Miss Marple, observing quietly from her chair near the window, noted the authentic quality of his grief, the way his hands trembled not with nervousness, but with the physical aftermath of shock. When pressed about the altered will, Julian's composure cracked further. 3 weeks ago, she summoned me to London specifically to discuss it. Said I needed to learn the value of honest work before I could be trusted with the family fortune. The irony is that I had actually begun to turn things around, found employment, started paying back the debts. But Mother had already made her decision. Miss Marple observed the young man with the careful attention she might have given to a piece of particularly complex needlework. His grief appeared genuine, but grief and desperation were not mutually exclusive. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that even loving children could be driven to terrible acts when circumstances pressed too hard. Mrs. Vale's interview proved far more revealing, though perhaps not in the ways Inspector Merryweather had anticipated. The housekeeper entered the library with the rigid composure of someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. But her careful control began to fracture under formal questioning. "The letters," she began, then stopped, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. Mrs. Whitstable was so distressed by them. Anonymous things, cruel insinuations about matters that should have been left buried. She tried to hide her worry, but I could see how they affected her. "What sort of insinuations, Mrs. Vale?" The older woman's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been fear. "About the war years, Inspector. About decisions that were made regarding the evacuee children who were placed here at Hazeldown. There had been an incident, a girl from the Bethany home in Exeter. Mrs. Whitstable had to make a difficult choice about her placement, and there were those who never forgave her for it." Miss Marple's pale eyes sharpened with interest. In her experience, the sins of wartime, when ordinary people were forced to make impossible choices under extraordinary circumstances, often returned to haunt the present in unexpected ways. The mention of Bethany Home carried particular resonance. Such institutions dealt with society's most vulnerable, and decisions made there could leave lasting wounds. "Did Mrs. Whitstable show you these letters directly?" "No, sir, but I may have read one that was left open on her desk." Mrs. Vale's admission came reluctantly, her face burning with shame. It said terrible things about justice delayed and suggested that some debts could only be paid with a life. Mrs. Whitstable was quite beside herself. The revelation that the threatening letters had vanished during the night added another layer of complexity to the crime. Someone had entered Mrs. Whitstable's private sitting room and removed evidence that might have identified the killer, or perhaps evidence that implicated someone the killer wished to protect. Tom Pritchard's interview revealed the careful balance of dependence and resentment that often existed between great houses and those who served them. The gardener's weathered hands remained steady as he answered questions, but his eyes held the wariness of a man who understood that his position made him vulnerable to suspicion. "Mrs. Whitstable was a fair employer," he said carefully. "But she had strong opinions about right and wrong. There's been talk in the village about changes she'd been considering. Reducing staff, selling portions of the estate to developers. Not everyone was pleased with her plans." Miss Marple noted the way Tom's gaze drifted toward the windows overlooking the grounds he had tended for 30 years, recognizing the deep attachment that could develop between a man and the land he worked. Such connections, when threatened, could drive people to unexpected extremes. The interview with Miss Blake provided crucial technical details about the ribbon substitution that had made the murder possible. The school teacher's precise memory painted a picture of careful premeditation that impressed even Inspector Merryweather. "The darker ribbon was from our church supplies," she confirmed with characteristic accuracy. "We used it sparingly for only 3 or 4 cones, placed in the center of the barrow where they would naturally be distributed last. For Mrs. Whitstable to receive one so early in the proceedings, someone must have deliberately selected and repositioned it." As the afternoon progressed, Inspector Merryweather's examination of the physical evidence began to reveal the sophisticated nature of the crime. In the parish room, they discovered the remaining rolls of ribbon, including the darker blue that had been used to retie the fatal cone. Miss Marple's careful examination revealed crucial details that others had overlooked. "It is an awkward ribbon," she observed mildly, allowing the stiff material to slide through her fingers. "It does not take a bow well for those without considerable practice. And here," She indicated a section where the ribbon showed signs of having been tied and then flattened. Caught in the weave was a faint dusting of granulated sugar, and, when she brought it delicately to her nose, the trace of a familiar scent. "Not violet," she murmured thoughtfully, "but almond, though not the harsh bitterness of the poison. Something sweeter, more refined, the sort of essence used in fine baking, perhaps." Dr. Aldridge's arrival with additional evidence provided another piece of the puzzle. "You asked about the glass," he said to Inspector Merriweather, producing a small wrapped parcel. "There were several on the dais, but one carried an unusual scent. Bitter almond mixed with something floral. Not poison, but perfume of some kind. And there were sticky marks on the stem, as if it had been handled by someone with sugared fingers." The discovery of the torn note in the parish room dustbin provided the most significant breakthrough of the day. Martha Pike, pale but determined, had brought the fragment to Mrs. Vale, who immediately recognized its potential importance. The scrap bore the remnants of what appeared to be a threatening message, written in a hand that attempted elegance but achieved only effort. "Ashamed of Bethany. Do right at last. Tonight, by the yews." Most significantly, at the very bottom where the tear had spared a flourish, there remained the final letter of a signature, an elaborate S with loops that spoke of old-fashioned penmanship lessons and careful practice. Miss Marple examined the fragment with the attention she might have given to a particularly complex pattern. "The parish room dustbin," she murmured. "One does not dispose of incriminating evidence in one's own wastebasket. One goes to a place where refuse is collected communally, where individual responsibility becomes diffused among the general detritus of village life." As the shadows lengthened across Hazeldown's grounds and the investigation took on the methodical rhythm of careful police work, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological landscape of the crime. Someone had orchestrated Mrs. Whitstable's death with remarkable sophistication, using the innocent rituals of village celebration to mask deliberate murder. The substituted ribbon, the lure to the yew path, the careful timing, all suggested a mind that thought several steps ahead. Yet there were inconsistencies that troubled her. The missing letters suggested panic after the fact, a scrambling to conceal evidence that should have been considered beforehand. The torn note in the parish dustbin spoke of someone who understood the psychology of disposal but had acted hastily. Most intriguingly, the elaborate S signature suggested someone with pretensions to gentility, someone who had been taught to write beautifully and maintained the habit even in anonymous correspondence. "Emmeline," she said quietly to her friend as they walked through the garden where chalk marks still outlined the scene of the crime, "I find myself thinking about the nature of justice and revenge. Someone killed Mrs. Whitstable not merely for gain, but to settle an old score. The connection to Bethany home, the deliberate cruelty of the method, the timing during a celebration, all suggest a mind consumed with the desire for a particular kind of satisfaction." The church clock struck 6 as they made their way back toward the village, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, a murderer was probably reviewing the day's events, wondering whether their carefully constructed deception would prove sufficient to escape the consequences of their deadly act. But Miss Marple, with the patient persistence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature, was beginning to see the threads that would eventually weave themselves into the pattern of truth. The obvious suspects, Julian with his debts, Mrs. Vale with her access to poison and household arrangements, Tom Pritchard with his connection to the cyanide, all provided convenient explanations for the crime. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that in villages like Wickham Common, the truth was rarely as simple as it first appeared. The soil of such places was too rich with history, too layered with old grievances and buried secrets, for any crime to have just one dimension. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky over the peaceful countryside, Miss Marple wound her ball of wool with characteristic patience and prepared to continue her quiet observations. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and perhaps the key that would unlock the carefully guarded secret of who had murdered Eleanor Whitstable. and why? The morning brought with it the particular quality of light that follows great revelations, clear and somehow expectant, as if the countryside itself were preparing to surrender more of its carefully guarded secrets. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom when her mind was particularly engaged, and made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Finch presided over the village's communications with the efficiency of someone who understood that information was the most valuable currency in rural England. "About those telephone calls to Hazeldown," Miss Marple began gently, her inquiry wrapped in the innocent curiosity of an elderly lady with time for conversation. Mrs. Finch, whose duty and natural inquisitiveness ran on parallel tracks, was more than willing to share what she had observed. "Several over the past fortnight, Miss Marple," she confided, lowering her voice with the conspiratorial air of someone imparting significant intelligence. "The most recent was yesterday morning, just before the party, but here's what struck me as odd. When I had to cut in due to a line fault, the caller rang off immediately when Mrs. Vale answered, and the connection had that particular echo one gets from the schoolroom extension." This revelation sent Miss Marple's mind working with renewed vigor. The schoolroom extension suggested Miss Blake, yet the teacher had seemed genuinely shocked by the murder. Either she was an accomplished actress, or there were layers to this case that had yet to be uncovered. At Hazeldown, Inspector Merryweather's morning examination of the physical evidence yielded crucial new information. Dr. Aldridge's more detailed analysis of the poisoned almond revealed something that had been missed in the initial shock of discovery. The sugar coating showed signs of having been applied twice. "A double dip is never done in proper confectionery work," Mr. Pettigrew explained when summoned, his hands trembling slightly as he considered the implications. "The first coat must have failed, or someone needed to conceal evidence of tampering. No one in my establishment would countenance such shoddy work for presentation." Miss Marple examined the remaining almonds with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex piece of needlework. The fatal almond had indeed been treated differently. The sugar shell near a hairline crack had crystallized unevenly, suggesting that someone had carefully inserted the poison and then re-dipped the sweet to conceal their work. More intriguingly, when she brought the darker ribbon to her nose again, she detected not only the faint bitter scent of cyanide, but something else, a sweeter, more refined almond fragrance that spoke of culinary expertise rather than chemical knowledge. "Not the harsh bitterness of the poison," she murmured thoughtfully, "but something that belongs in a kitchen rather than a potting shed. The sort of essence used in fine baking, perhaps." The morning's investigations took on new urgency when Miss Penfold arrived at Hazeldown, her usual composure showing signs of strain. She carried with her a small tin that would prove to add another piece to the increasingly complex puzzle. "Inspector, I wonder if this has any bearing," she began, producing the container with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. "The church ladies used this heliotrope talc in the parish room Wednesday evening when we were preparing for the bonnet competition. The air was quite thick with the scent afterward, and I noticed it again yesterday when I was arranging the prize cards on the dais." Dr. Aldridge examined the tin with professional interest. "Heliotrope has a powdery, almond-like fragrance that can sometimes be mistaken for the scent of cyanide by those unfamiliar with the poison's true odor. This could explain the perfumed glass we found on the dais. Someone with sugared fingers who had been handling almonds and was dusted with this particular powder." The revelation cast Mrs. Penfold's constant presence at village functions in a new light, though Miss Marple was careful not to let her suspicions show. The vicar's wife was precisely the sort of person who would have access to everything and everyone, whose helpful nature would be above question, and whose intimate knowledge of village routines would make her invisible in plain sight. The afternoon brought Miss Blake to Hazeldown for her formal interview, and it was during this careful questioning that the case took another significant turn. The schoolteacher's composure, which had held admirably through the initial crisis, began to show hairline cracks under Inspector Merryweather's methodical inquiries. Miss Marple, observing quietly from her chair near the window, noted the way Miss Blake's hands tightened almost imperceptibly when the conversation turned to the parish room preparations. More tellingly, when asked about her telephone call to Hazeldown on the morning of the party, the teacher's explanation seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "I rang to confirm the children's arrival time," Miss Blake said with careful precision. "But when Mrs. Vale answered, I quite forgot what I had called about. It was such a confused morning with all the preparations." Later, when Miss Marple visited the schoolhouse on the pretext of admiring the children's Easter drawings, she made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the crime. Miss Blake's sitting room bore all the hallmarks of a methodical mind. Books shelved with mathematical precision, a blotter that had been recently changed to a fresh sheet, and the faint sweetness of a scent that combined heliotrope with something more citrus-like. Most significantly, caught in the edge of the blotter frame was a curl of paper, thin as onion skin, bearing the ghost of ink marks that suggested the elegant penmanship of someone trained in the old-fashioned way. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she recognized the type of person who maintained such careful writing habits. Someone who had been taught to form letters with proper flourishes and had never abandoned the practice. The day's most dramatic discovery came when Martha Pike arrived at Emmeline's cottage that evening, pale with excitement and clutching a small object that would tie together several loose threads of the investigation. "Miss Marple, I found this in the parish room when I was cleaning," Martha explained breathlessly, unwrapping a single amethyst bead. "It was underneath the table where we had been working with the ribbons. But look, there's something stuck in the drill hole." Miss Marple examined the bead with a gentle reverence due to such a significant clue. Cemented in the tiny opening was a small clump of hardened sugar that, when she brought it carefully to her nose, carried the faintest whisper of sweet almond essence, not the brutal scent of cyanide, but the refined fragrance of culinary preparation. "Someone needed to test their work," she observed quietly, more to herself than to the others present. "If you were preparing a poisoned sweet and wanted to ensure that the scent was properly masked, you might press it against something already perfumed, something that would tell you whether the deception was convincing." The psychological implications fascinated Miss Marple. Here was evidence of someone who thought not just one step ahead, but several. Someone who understood that the success of their crime would depend not just on the poison itself, but on ensuring that it remained undetected until the crucial moment. As the evening shadows lengthened across Wickham Common, and the investigation entered its second full day, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious psychology of the killer they were seeking. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but something far more calculated, the work of someone who understood the rhythms of village life so intimately that they could manipulate them like a conductor directing a familiar symphony. The sweet almond scent on the ribbon, the carefully tested bead, the double-dipped coating, the strategic telephone call, all pointed to someone whose relationship with the village was both intimate and deceptive. Someone who moved through the community with such practiced invisibility that their presence at crucial moments would never be questioned. "Emmeline," she said quietly as they prepared for bed, "I find myself thinking about the nature of helpful people. There are those who help because they genuinely care for others, and those who help because it gives them access and information. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between the two, particularly when the helpful person has had years to perfect their disguise." The church clock struck 11 as Miss Marple wound her ball of wool with characteristic patience, her mind working through the patterns that were beginning to emerge from the tangle of clues and observations. Somewhere in Wickham Common, a murderer was probably lying awake, reviewing the day's events and wondering whether their carefully constructed facade would prove sufficient to escape the consequences of their deadly act. But Miss Marple, with the quiet persistence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle currents of human nature, was beginning to see the threads that would eventually weave themselves into the complete pattern of truth. The amethyst bead lay on her nightstand, a small but significant piece of evidence that spoke not just of guilt, but of a mind sophisticated enough to plan the perfect murder, and perhaps careless enough to leave behind the very clues that would ultimately ensure its solution. The morning of the third day brought with it an air of expectant tension, as if Wickham Common had collectively drawn breath and was waiting to see what revelations the continued investigation might yield. Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature had taught her that truth often emerged not in dramatic confessions, but in the accumulation of small inconsistencies, made her way to the vicarage with the ostensible purpose of admiring the spring flowers, but with the deeper intention of examining the parish records that might illuminate the Bethany home connection. The vicar, a conscientious man who wore his pastoral duties with gentle earnestness, received her in his study, where bound volumes of parish magazines sat in neat rows, their green covers bearing the accumulated dust and memories of wartime years. Mrs. Penfold, ever helpful, brought tea and a plate of perfectly sugared biscuits, her movements carrying their usual efficiency, despite the strain that showed in the tight lines around her eyes. "You mentioned yesterday the evacuee children who were placed at Hazeldown," Miss Marple began, with the casual interest of someone making polite conversation. "Such a difficult time for everyone involved. I imagine the records from those years tell quite remarkable stories." The vicar's fingers moved with practiced familiarity to the volume marked 1940-1943. And Mrs. Penfold, with the helpful precision that seemed second nature to her, supplied details before being asked. There were several children placed at Hazeldown over the years. 2 brothers named Carr, a quiet boy from Stepney, and there was the girl from Bethany Home in Exeter, Sylvia Dale. Eleanor always felt a particular responsibility for that placement. Miss Marple noted the careful way Mrs. Penfold spoke of the arrangement, the slight hesitation that suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface. When the vicar located the relevant entry, written in a careful copperplate hand, she observed the elegant flourishes of the penmanship, particularly the elaborate final ace in the signature that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the fragment found in the parish room dustbin. There was some difficulty with the placement, the vicar admitted reluctantly. Eleanor felt the child would benefit from a quieter household environment. These decisions were never easy during wartime. Everyone was doing their best under impossible circumstances. The phrase, "everyone did their best," carried the particular weight that such statements acquire when they are used to cover uncomfortable truths, and Miss Marple filed it away with the growing collection of evasions and half-explanations that seemed to surround the Bethany home connection. Her departure from the vicarage brought an unexpected encounter with Conrad Fielding, whose notebook had become such a constant companion that it seemed an extension of his professional identity. His greeting carried the practiced charm of someone accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources, but Miss Marple detected something more calculating beneath his journalistic manner. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity about village life," he said with apparent casualness. "I've been hearing fascinating stories about wartime arrangements and the challenges of caring for evacuee children. Quite complex situations, from what I gather." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with the mild interest of someone discussing the weather. "Though I find that the most complex situations often have remarkably simple explanations if one looks carefully enough." Fielding's smile carried a hint of something sharper than mere professional interest. "Actually, I should be honest about my purpose here. I'm investigating a story about wartime charity scandals, particularly involving Bethany Home. There were allegations of misallocated funds, children placed inappropriately, a matron who was quietly forced out. Mrs. Whitstable's name appeared in several documents as someone who might have had relevant information. The revelation cast Fielding's presence at the garden party in an entirely new light, transforming him from curious observer to active participant in whatever drama had been unfolding around Mrs. Whitstable's final days. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly significant stitch in a complex pattern. "And you hope to extract this information during a village Easter fete?" she inquired with the gentle reproach that elderly ladies could deliver like perfectly aimed arrows. "I had been encouraged by a local source," Fielding admitted, his professional composure showing hairline cracks. "Anonymous communications, actually. Notes left at the post office, telephone messages from what sounded like the schoolroom extension. Someone was quite eager for Mrs. Whitstable's wartime activities to receive proper scrutiny." The mention of the schoolroom extension sent Miss Marple's mind working with renewed intensity. Combined with the elegant penmanship she had observed in the parish records, it suggested a pattern of behavior that was both methodical and deeply personal. At Hazeldown, Inspector Merryweather's morning examination of the physical evidence had yielded disturbing new information. Mr. Pettigrew, summoned once again to explain the technical aspects of the poisoned almond, had demonstrated with increasing distress how the double coating would have been accomplished, not in his meticulously maintained shop, but in a kitchen where sugar syrup could be heated discreetly and the work done without observation. "The parish room has a small gas hob," he explained with obvious reluctance to cast aspersions on sacred ground. "We used it Wednesday evening for the tea urn. Anyone familiar with confectionery work could have managed the recoating there," Miss Marple suggested with the gentle helpfulness that masked her deeper purpose, that it would be charitable to prepare a sympathy basket for the Hazeldown staff. Within the hour, the parish room had been transformed into a scene of organized compassion, with brown paper, string, and ribbons spread across the long table in unconscious recreation of the preparations that had preceded the murder. The gathering that assembled, Mrs. Penfold, Miss Blake, Martha Pike, and several other helpful souls, provided Miss Marple with an opportunity to observe behavior under the guise of charitable activity. Most significantly, when she requested assistance with tying ribbons around small parcels, the different approaches revealed telling details about manual habits and personality. Mrs. Penfold worked with magazine-perfect technique, creating plump, decorative bows that photographed beautifully but would never survive practical use. Miss Blake, by contrast, tied flat, workmanlike knots, the sort that stayed secure under stress, exactly like the knot that had secured the fatal cone's darker ribbon. "How practical," Miss Marple observed, admiring the schoolteacher's firm technique. "Such secure knots, they would never come undone, accidentally." "For children, one must think of function over appearance," Miss Blake replied with a defensive edge that seemed disproportionate to the innocent observation. "Pretty loops are pulled apart immediately. A reef knot serves its purpose." The afternoon brought news that elevated the investigation to new urgency. Mr. Pettigrew arrived at Hazeldown in considerable distress, reporting that his shop had been broken into during his customary tea hour. Nothing of value had been taken, but the poisons register had been disturbed, and a bottle of bitter almond essence had vanished from the shelf. "Bitter almond essence," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, recognizing immediately how such a substance might serve to mask the harsh scent of cyanide while providing the sweet, refined fragrance that had been detected on the ribbon. Not the crude bitterness of poison, but something that belongs in a baker's kitchen. The break-in showed signs of hesitant hands and imperfect planning. A screwdriver applied clumsily to the back door, the poisons register opened to a blank page in a futile attempt to suggest nothing had been signed at all. Most tellingly, a scatter of sugar grains on the counter spoke of someone who had handled the stolen essence with hands still sticky from confectionery work. Inspector Merryweather's examination of the scene revealed the psychological profile of someone acting under increasing pressure. The theft had been accomplished during the narrow window when Mr. Pettigrew took his afternoon tea, suggesting intimate knowledge of village routines, but the execution showed signs of haste and anxiety that contrasted sharply with the sophisticated planning of the original murder. As the shadows began to lengthen across Wickham Common and the investigation entered its third day, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious psychology of the killer they were seeking. This was someone who had planned the perfect murder with remarkable sophistication. The substituted ribbon, the double-coated almond, the careful timing, but who was now scrambling to cover tracks that should have been considered beforehand. The pattern suggested someone whose confidence in their own cleverness had been shaken by the thoroughness of the investigation, someone who was discovering that murder, once committed, generated consequences that extended far beyond the immediate act. The theft of the bitter almond essence spoke of panic, of someone trying to eliminate evidence that connected them to the crime's technical execution. "Emmeline," she said quietly as they walked through the village in the gathering dusk, "I find myself thinking about the nature of helpful people. There are those who help because they genuinely care for others, and those who help because it provides access and invisibility. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between the two, particularly when the helpful person has had years to perfect their disguise." The church clock struck 8 as they made their way back to the cottage, and somewhere in the peaceful countryside, a murderer was probably reviewing the day's events with growing anxiety. The careful facade that had taken years to construct was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of investigation, and Miss Marple, with the patient persistence of someone who understood that truth emerged gradually, was beginning to see the threads that would eventually weave themselves into the complete pattern of guilt and retribution. The obvious suspects still provided convenient explanations. Julian with his debts, Mrs. Vale with her access and knowledge, Tom Pritchard with his connection to the poison. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that in villages like Wickham Common, the truth was rarely as simple as it first appeared. The soil of such places was too rich with history, too layered with old grievances and buried secrets, for any crime to have just one dimension. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new opportunities for observation, and perhaps the moment when someone's carefully maintained composure would finally crack under the weight of their own deception. The amethyst bead still lay on her nightstand, a small but significant reminder that even the most sophisticated criminals left traces of their passage through the world of ordinary objects and human relationships. The fourth morning dawned with the brittle clarity that sometimes follows nights of revelation, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the methodical work of observation that had served her so well throughout a lifetime of understanding human nature. The frost on the hedgerows sparkled, as though the village had been sugared in the night, and there was something in the quality of light that suggested secrets were preparing to surrender themselves to patient scrutiny. Inspector Merriweather arrived at Hazeldown with the purposeful stride of a man who understood that in cases of murder, momentum must be maintained, even when the path forward seemed obscured by competing theories and conflicting evidence. His examination of the physical evidence had yielded disturbing new information overnight. Dr. Aldridge's more detailed analysis of the poisoned almond revealed that the sugar coating showed clear signs of having been applied twice, a technique that spoke of considerable expertise in confectionery work. "A double dip is never done in proper confectionery," Mr. Pettigrew explained when summoned, his hands trembling slightly as he considered the implications of his professional knowledge being turned to such dark purposes. The first coat must have failed, or someone needed to conceal evidence of tampering. No respectable confectioner would countenance such work for presentation. Miss Marple examined the remaining evidence with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex piece of needlework. The fatal almond had indeed been treated differently. The sugar shell near a hairline crack had crystallized unevenly, suggesting that someone had carefully inserted the poison through a tiny drilled hole and then redipped the sweet to conceal their work. More intriguingly, when she brought the darker ribbon to her nose again, she detected not only the faint bitter scent of cyanide, but something else, a sweeter, more refined almond fragrance that belonged in a kitchen rather than a potting shed. The morning's most significant development came when Miss Marple, following an intuition that had served her well in previous investigations, made her way to the schoolhouse with the ostensible purpose of admiring the children's Easter drawings. Miss Blake received her in the small sitting room that adjoined the classroom, where everything bore the particular neatness that Miss Marple had come to associate with minds that sought order as a refuge from inner turmoil. "I wanted to ask you about Bethany Home," Miss Marple said gently, when the first ordinary pleasantries had cleared the air of stiffness. "One hears such different things about those years, and it is my impression that people sometimes confuse difficult choices with wrong ones." Miss Blake's hands, which had been folded with schoolmistress composure, tightened almost imperceptibly. The silence that followed carried the weight of years of carefully maintained deception, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular quality of someone setting down a burden they had carried too long. "My name is Iris Blake now," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the small window where weak sunlight rested upon a pot of primulas. "It was not always. I was Sylvia Dale when I was a girl at Bethany Home." The admission fell with the quiet finality of something long carried and at last set down, and Miss Marple received it with the gentle understanding of someone who had witnessed many such moments of painful honesty. "I wrote the letters," Miss Blake continued, her voice steadying as if the decision to speak truth provided its own strength. "I wrote them and I telephoned from the schoolroom extension. I wanted Mrs. Whitstable to acknowledge what had happened, what her decision had cost. Not money," she added quickly, reading the suspicion that had become the air everyone breathed. "I never asked for that. I asked for an apology and for the truth to be recorded properly with the parish." The revelation that Miss Blake was the source of the threatening correspondence added another layer of complexity to the investigation, but it also eliminated one suspect while potentially illuminating the true motive for the crime. Her explanation of the wartime placement that had gone wrong, a vulnerable child sent from Hazeldown to a situation where she was hurt, provided the historical context that had been missing from their understanding of Mrs. Whitstable's final weeks. The morning brought news that elevated the investigation to new urgency. Mrs. Finch arrived at Hazeldown in considerable distress, reporting that the vicarage had been broken into during the night. The study had been ransacked with a precision that spoke of someone seeking specific items. The parish magazines from 1940 to 1943 had been taken, along with any records that might illuminate the wartime evacuee arrangements. Miss Marple's examination of the scene revealed telling details that others might have overlooked. Caught in the hinge of a cupboard was a minute thread of dark blue ribbon, the same stiff, economical material that had been used to retie the fatal cone. More significantly, the break-in showed signs of someone with intimate knowledge of the vicarage layout, someone who knew exactly where to find keys and records without the fumbling that would characterize a stranger's search. The investigation took another crucial turn when they returned to the parish room, where charitable work continued under Mrs. Penfold's supervision. The vicar's wife moved through the familiar space with her usual efficiency, but Miss Marple's observant eye detected subtle changes in her demeanor. A tremor in hands that were normally rock-steady, a tightness around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and growing anxiety. Miss Marple's examination of the small gas hob revealed a tiny, crescent-shaped scorch mark on the enamel that had not been there during Wednesday's preparations. The mark was accompanied by a faint caramel scent and a scatter of sugar grains too far from the work table to be explained by normal baking activities. Someone had heated sugar syrup at that hob, working quickly and perhaps nervously, standing at the window to judge their work in the better light. "Who has been in and out since Wednesday?" Inspector Merriweather asked Mrs. Penfold, whose response carried a note of frustration that seemed disproportionate to the innocent question. "Everyone," she said, her voice roughening slightly. "There have been committees and practices and, well, life. That is the difficulty of parish rooms. They exist to be used." When Miss Marple suggested examining the heliotrope talc that had been used during the bonnet competition preparations, Mrs. Penfold's reaction provided another piece of the puzzle. Despite her claim of having little sensitivity to scents, she handled the tin with the unconscious expertise of someone familiar with its properties, and her fingers left impressions in the accumulated powder that showed the distinctive patterns of someone who worked regularly with confectionery. "Such a lovely scent," Miss Marple observed mildly, "though I confess I sometimes find it difficult to distinguish from sweet almond essence. The two can be remarkably similar to those unfamiliar with their subtle differences." Mrs. Penfold's response was perhaps a fraction too quick, too carefully rehearsed. "Oh, I wouldn't know about that. I'm not much of a one for distinguishing scents. Too many years of church flowers, I expect." Yet Miss Marple had observed throughout their interactions that Mrs. Penfold possessed an exceptionally acute sense of smell, commenting knowledgeably on various fragrances and identifying herbs by scent alone. Such a contradiction suggested someone who was being deliberately misleading about capabilities that might prove incriminating. The afternoon brought Conrad Fielding to Hazeldown with a collection of documents that he claimed would illuminate Mrs. Whitstable's wartime activities. Inspector Merriweather examined the papers with professional skepticism, noting inconsistencies in handwriting and anachronistic elements that suggested forgery. Most tellingly, one document bore a watermark that was distinctly modern, and several showed the characteristic fade pattern of ink that had been artificially aged, perhaps through exposure to steam from confectionery work. As the shadows lengthened across Hazeldown's grounds and the investigation entered its fourth day, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychological landscape of a crime that had revealed layers of deception extending far beyond the simple act of murder. Someone had orchestrated not just Mrs. Whitstable's death, but an elaborate campaign of character assassination designed to provide posthumous justification for the killing. The forged documents, the stolen parish records, the carefully timed revelations of supposed wartime scandals, all suggested a mind that thought not just about immediate revenge, but about historical vindication. This was someone who wanted not just to kill Mrs. Whitstable, but to destroy her reputation and create a narrative that would excuse their actions in the court of village opinion. "Emmeline," she said quietly as they walked through the garden where chalk marks still outlined the scene of the crime, "I find myself thinking about the nature of helpful people. There are those who help because they genuinely care for others, and those who help because it provides access and invisibility. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between the two, particularly when the helpful person has had years to perfect their disguise." The church clock struck 6 as they made their way back toward the village, and Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern that was beginning to emerge from the tangle of evidence and observation. Someone with intimate knowledge of village routines, access to all the necessary materials, and the confectionery skills required for the sophisticated murder had moved among them with such practiced invisibility that their presence at crucial moments would never be questioned. The obvious suspects, Julian with his debts, Mrs. Vale with her household access, Tom Pritchard with his connection to the poison, all provided convenient explanations for the crime. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that in villages like Wickham Common, the truth was rarely as simple as it first appeared. The soil of such places was too rich with observation, too layered with interconnected relationships, for any secret to remain buried forever. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new opportunities for the careful observation that would eventually reveal which of the helpful, familiar faces concealed the mind of a murderer. The amethyst bead still lay in her evidence collection, a small but significant reminder that even the most sophisticated criminals left traces of their passage through the world of ordinary objects and human relationships. Somewhere in the peaceful countryside, a killer was probably reviewing the day's events with growing desperation, wondering whether their carefully constructed facade would prove sufficient to escape the consequences of their deadly act. But Miss Marple, with the patient persistence of someone who understood that truth emerged gradually through the accumulation of small observations, was beginning to see the threads that would eventually weave themselves into the complete pattern of guilt and retribution. The fifth morning brought with it the particular quality of tension that precedes great revelations, when the accumulated weight of small observations begins to settle into an unmistakable pattern. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom when her mind was particularly engaged, and found herself drawn to the methodical work of connecting threads that had been gathering throughout the investigation like wool in a careful knitter's basket. Inspector Merriweather arrived at Emmeline's cottage with news that would prove crucial to their understanding of the case. During the night, his constables had made a discovery in the church vestry, a small collection of items hidden beneath loose floorboards that included the remaining bitter almond essence from Mr. Pettigrew's shop, several lengths of the darker ribbon, and most significantly, a notebook containing detailed observations of Mrs. Whitstable's daily routines, written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand. Miss Marple examined the notebook with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex pattern. The entries revealed months of methodical surveillance disguised as neighborly concern, tracking Mrs. Whitstable's movements with the precision of someone planning not merely an encounter, but the perfect moment for its execution. The handwriting bore those distinctive flourishes she had come to recognize, the elaborate loops and careful curves of someone trained in the old-fashioned way, who maintained proper penmanship even in private correspondence. "The psychological preparation is quite remarkable," she observed to the inspector, her pale eyes moving over the careful notations. "Someone has been planning this not for weeks, but for months. Yet see here." She indicated several entries where the handwriting showed signs of agitation, the careful letters becoming slightly irregular. There are moments when emotion overcame methodology. That is often where we find our most revealing clues. The morning's examination of the physical evidence yielded additional confirmation of the sophisticated nature of the crime. Dr. Aldridge's final analysis of the poisoned almond revealed microscopic tool marks where a tiny hole had been drilled to insert the poison, then carefully sealed with sugar syrup and redipped to conceal the tampering. The technique required not only confectionery expertise, but access to precision tools and considerable patience. Miss Marple suggested, with the gentle persistence that had served her well in previous investigations, that they visit the parish room to examine the scene where much of the Easter preparation had taken place. Mrs. Penfold, summoned to assist with their inquiries, arrived with her usual efficiency, but Miss Marple's observant eye detected subtle changes in her demeanor, a tightness around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, hands that trembled almost imperceptibly when handling familiar objects. The parish room bore the accumulated sense of village life, mothballs and lavender, candle wax and old wood. But Miss Marple's sensitive nose detected something else beneath the familiar odors, a faint sweetness that spoke of recent confectionery work, the ghost of that distinctive bitter almond fragrance that could mask more sinister scents. "Such a useful space," Miss Marple observed, moving toward the small gas hob in the corner. "One can accomplish so much here without drawing attention. I imagine you've prepared countless treats for village functions over the years, Mrs. Penfold?" "Indeed," Mrs. Penfold replied, but her voice carried a note of wariness that hadn't been there in their earlier conversations. "Though I confess I'm more comfortable with simple biscuits than elaborate confectionery." Miss Marple's examination of the hob revealed what she had expected to find, a tiny, crescent-shaped scorch mark on the enamel that spoke of sugar syrup heated at high temperature. Nearby, almost invisible unless one knew to look for them, were scattered grains of crystallized sugar and the faintest trace of that bitter almond scent that belonged in a baker's kitchen rather than a potting shed. "How interesting," she murmured, more to herself than to the others present. "Someone has been doing quite sophisticated work here, the sort that requires considerable skill and, I should imagine, considerable motivation." When she turned to Mrs. Penfold with a request to demonstrate the proper technique for securing packages with ribbon, The vicar's wife complied with her usual helpfulness, but Miss Marple watched with growing certainty as those competent hands automatically formed the flat, practical knots that would never come undone under stress, exactly like the knot that had secured the fatal cone's darker ribbon. "Such reliable knots," Miss Marple observed with gentle admiration. "They speak of someone who understands that function must sometimes take precedence over appearance, though I confess I've always found it curious how people reveal their true natures in such small, unconscious actions." Mrs. Penfold's hands stilled for just a moment, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of something, calculation perhaps, or growing alarm, that crossed her features before her practiced composure returned. The crucial moment came when Miss Marple produced the amethyst bead that had been found in the parish room, allowing it to catch the afternoon light as she examined it with apparent casual interest. "Such a lovely thing," she said, her voice carrying that particular gentleness she reserved for moments of great significance. "Though I find it fascinating that someone used it to test whether the scent of bitter almond essence would be sufficient to mask the harsh odor of cyanide. The sugar residue in the drill hole tells quite a remarkable story about methodical preparation." Mrs. Penfold's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from her face, and her hands, which had been folded with their usual composure, began to tremble visibly. For a moment, the carefully constructed facade of helpful efficiency cracked entirely, revealing something desperate and trapped beneath. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had risen slightly in pitch, carrying the particular quality of someone whose carefully maintained deception was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness, her pale eyes never leaving Mrs. Penfold's face. The wartime years were so difficult for everyone, weren't they? Such impossible choices to make, such heavy responsibilities for those who tried to help. I imagine the evacuee arrangements must have weighed particularly heavily on those who felt responsible for the children's welfare. The mention of the evacuees struck Mrs. Penfold like a physical blow. Her composure, which had held through years of careful performance, finally began to crumble under the weight of Miss Marple's quiet persistence. A bead of perspiration formed on her upper lip, and her eyes, usually so bright with helpful efficiency, flickered with the desperate light of someone whose secret world was collapsing around them. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "You don't know what it was like, the responsibility, the guilt of knowing that your decisions could destroy an innocent life." Inspector Merriweather stepped forward quietly, his presence a reminder that this gentle conversation was, in fact, an interrogation. But Miss Marple raised a slight hand, understanding that Mrs. Penfold was balanced on the edge of revelation and that any sudden movement might send her retreating back into silence. The afternoon light slanted through the parish room windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets finally released into the air. Somewhere in Wickham Common, the ordinary business of village life continued, but in this small room where so many community celebrations had been planned, the careful architecture of a 30-year deception was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of accumulated guilt and the patient persistence of an elderly lady who understood that truth, like wool in a careful knitter's hands, must be drawn out one thread at a time. Mrs. Penfold stood frozen at the center of it all, her helpful facade finally cracking to reveal the desperate woman beneath. Someone who had carried the burden of an old mistake until it had transformed her into something she had never intended to become. The critical reaction Miss Marple had been waiting for had finally arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end of one of the most sophisticated murders Wickham Common had ever witnessed. The silence that followed Mrs. Penfold's whispered admission stretched through the parish room like a taut wire, charged with the accumulated tension of secrets finally approaching the surface. Miss Marple remained by the window, her pale eyes gentle but unwavering, understanding that this moment required the delicate balance of patience and persistence that had served her so well throughout a lifetime of observing human nature at its most vulnerable. Mrs. Penfold's hands, which had moved through countless village functions with such practiced efficiency, now trembled as she reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. The helpful facade that had been her armor for so many years was cracking piece by piece, revealing the frightened woman beneath who had carried the weight of an old decision until it had transformed her into something she had never intended to become. The responsibility, she whispered again, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the hushed room. You don't understand what it was like, Miss Marple. The impossible choices, the weight of knowing that your decisions could destroy an innocent life. Miss Marple moved closer with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that confession, once begun, must be allowed to flow at its own natural pace. Perhaps you could help me understand, Mrs. Penfold, she said gently. I believe this concerns the evacuee arrangements during the war years, doesn't it? Particularly the placement of a young girl from Bethany Home in Exeter. The mention of Bethany Home struck Mrs. Penfold like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled further, tears beginning to trace silver lines down her cheeks. Sylvia Dale, she breathed, the name emerging like a prayer or a curse. Such a small, frightened child when she arrived. We thought, Eleanor and I both thought, that she would be better placed with a farming family than at the big house, with all its coming and going. Inspector Merriweather remained quietly alert, his notebook ready, but his manner carefully unobtrusive, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple admission of guilt. Miss Marple nodded with gentle encouragement, understanding the psychological landscape they were navigating. The Hendersons at Mill Farm, Mrs. Penfold continued, her voice growing stronger as if the act of speaking truth provided its own relief. They seemed so respectable, so proper, but they were not kind people, Miss Marple. The child was hurt there, badly hurt. And when she ran away and came to the vicarage, bleeding and terrified, Eleanor refused to reconsider the placement. The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding through the accumulated evidence of the past few days. Miss Marple began to see how the threads of old guilt and new revenge had woven themselves into the pattern that had culminated in Mrs. Whitstable's death. Mrs. Whitstable said the child was probably lying. Mrs. Penfold's voice hardened with remembered anger. That such accusations could ruin respectable people without proper evidence. She said that disturbed children often invented stories to gain attention or sympathy. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the careful attention of someone assembling the final pieces of a complex puzzle. And you, Mrs. Penfold, what did you believe? I believed Sylvia, came the quiet reply. But I was young then, newly married to the curate, with no authority of my own. Eleanor was the lady of the manor, the one everyone looked to for guidance. When she insisted the placement should stand, who was I to contradict her? The psychological landscape of the crime was becoming clearer to Miss Marple. This had not been a simple act of revenge, but something far more complex, driven by decades of accumulated guilt and the desperate need to silence the voice of conscience that had returned in the form of Miss Blake. So when Sylvia Dale returned as Miss Blake, Miss Marple observed with gentle certainty, when she began asking questions about the wartime arrangements, writing letters, making telephone calls from the schoolroom extension, you recognized the threat she posed, not just to Mrs. Whitstable, but to the carefully constructed piece you had built around your own role in those events. Mrs. Penfold nodded slowly, her tears flowing more freely now. She was so persistent, so determined to have the truth acknowledged. At first, I thought I could manage the situation, perhaps even convince Eleanor to offer some form of apology. But Eleanor was adamant. She insisted that wartime decisions couldn't be judged by peacetime standards, that she had done her best under impossible circumstances. Miss Marple moved to the small gas hob in the corner, her observant eye taking in details that others had missed. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. The scorch mark here, the scattered sugar grains, the faint scent of sweet almond essence. These tell the story of careful preparation, don't they, Mrs. Penfold?" The vicar's wife looked up with hollow eyes, her resistance finally crumbling completely. "I used apricot kernels," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "Crushed and steeped them to extract the prussic acid. It's an old method. My grandmother used to warn about bitter almonds for that very reason. I heated the mixture here, in the parish room, during the bonnet preparation evening when everyone was distracted." Inspector Merriweather leaned forward slightly, his professional instincts engaged by this crucial technical admission. Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation, understanding that each detail must be drawn out carefully. "The double coating of the almond," she observed, producing the evidence they had discovered. "You drilled a tiny hole, inserted the poison, then resealed and redipped the sweet to conceal your work. Such sophisticated confectionery technique speaks of considerable skill and practice." Mrs. Penfold nodded with the weary resignation of someone whose elaborate deception was finally collapsing. "I tested it on my rosary bead, the amethyst one that Martha found. I needed to know whether the sweet almond essence would mask the bitter scent sufficiently. The heliotrope talc helped too. Its powdery fragrance is remarkably similar to sweet almonds." The revelation of this methodical testing demonstrated the remarkable sophistication of Mrs. Penfold's planning. She had not simply committed murder, but had orchestrated every aspect of the crime with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her such an effective parish organizer. "The ribbon substitution," Miss Marple continued, allowing the darker blue material to slide through her fingers. "You knew where the spare ribbon was kept, knew the barrow would be left briefly unattended, knew exactly how to tie the flat, practical knot that would hold securely under stress. I guided her to select that particular cone," Mrs. Penfold admitted, her voice growing steadier as if confession provided its own relief. "When Mr. Pettigrew brought the barrow to the dais, I helped arrange the presentation, made sure the poisoned one was positioned where Eleanor would naturally reach for it. I even commented on how lovely the ribbons looked in the afternoon light to draw her attention to that area." The admission of this final manipulation, using her position as helpful organizer to ensure her victim's selection of the fatal sweet, revealed the chilling calculation behind what had appeared to be a community celebration. Mrs. Penfold had transformed the innocent ritual of an Easter garden party into a stage for perfectly orchestrated murder. Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that accompanied such revelations, the recognition of how accumulated guilt could transform an essentially decent person into something they had never intended to become. "And when the investigation began," she said gently, "when you realized how thoroughly Inspector Merriweather was examining the evidence, you panicked. The theft from Mr. Pettigrew's shop, the break-in at the vicarage to steal the parish records, these were not part of your original plan." Mrs. Penfold shook her head, fresh tears beginning to flow. "I thought if I could eliminate the evidence, create some confusion about the poison source, perhaps redirect suspicion, but everything I did only made matters worse. The forged documents I tried to feed to Mr. Fielding, the anonymous letters meant to cast doubt on Eleanor's character. None of it worked as I had hoped." Inspector Merriweather rose slowly, his duty clear despite the tragedy of the circumstances. "Mrs. Penfold," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I must ask you to accompany me to the station. There are formal charges that must be brought." Mrs. Penfold nodded with exhausted acceptance, gathering her handbag and cardigan with movements that seemed suddenly aged beyond her years. As she prepared to leave the parish room that had been the scene of so many innocent community gatherings, Miss Marple approached her with genuine compassion. "Mrs. Penfold," she said quietly, "I believe you began with the desire to protect a child, and that is not something to be dismissed lightly. But guilt, when it festers unaddressed for too long, can transform even the most generous impulses into something quite different." The vicar's wife looked up with eyes that held both gratitude and profound sorrow. "I told myself I was seeking justice for Sylvia," she whispered. But somewhere along the way, it became about my own need to be free of the guilt I'd carried for 30 years. Eleanor's death wouldn't bring back the child's innocence, wouldn't undo the harm that was done. I know that now. As Mrs. Penfold was led away, the parish room fell into a heavy silence, tainted by confession and the weight of shattered trust. Miss Marple stood by the window, looking out at the peaceful countryside where the ordinary business of village life would soon resume, forever changed by the knowledge that even the most helpful and familiar faces could conceal depths of desperation that might, under the right circumstances, bloom into deadly action. The truth, once revealed, was rarely simple, and its consequences often extended far beyond the immediate act of crime. In Wickham Common, as in villages everywhere, the soil was rich with buried secrets and old grievances that could, given time and pressure, produce the most unexpected and tragic of harvests. The silence that followed Mrs. Penfold's departure stretched through Wickham Common like the aftermath of a great storm when familiar landmarks remain standing, but the landscape has been forever altered. News of the arrest moved through the village with the peculiar speed reserved for events that everyone had half suspected and fervently hoped were untrue, leaving in its wake a profound sense of betrayal that would take months to fully process. At the vicarage, Reverend Penfold received Inspector Merryweather's quiet explanation with the dignity that had always characterized his ministry, though Miss Marple, who accompanied the inspector for reasons of tact rather than necessity, observed how his hands whitened against the arms of his chair when he learned of the parish records taken from his study. His sorrow was for the betrayal of trust more than for reputation, which spoke well of his character. The empty room seemed to echo with his wife's absence, a missing gravity that left teacups and prayer books looking oddly weightless in the afternoon light. Character resolutions and the aftermath. By unspoken consent, the remaining interviews were conducted quietly, without the drama of summonses or closed doors. Mrs. Vale arrived first at Hazeldown, composed but grey with fatigue, carrying an envelope she had finally decided could not remain hidden. Her confession about removing the threatening letters revealed the protective instinct that had driven her actions. Not self-preservation, but a desire to shield both Julian and Mrs. Whitstable's memory from further pain. "I took them, Inspector," she said simply, placing the letters on the library table. "Not to hide anything from myself, but to keep them from Mr. Julian. He is so impressionable in emotion, and from the village gossips. It seemed cruel that poor Mrs. Eleanor should be torn at even after death." The handwriting in these letters, with its careful flourishes and distinctive crossing of T's, matched perfectly with the notebook found in the vestry and the torn fragment from the parish dustbin, providing the final confirmation of Mrs. Penfold's authorship. Tom Pritchard's vindication came with Miss Marple's gentle but thorough explanation of the evidence found in his potting shed. "The paper twist was from last summer's wasp treatment," she told him kindly. "The dust patterns show it had stood in that one place for months. Even the teaspoon carries iron stains from paint mixing, not poison preparation. The bitter scent of almonds attaches itself to innocent gardeners as readily as to the guilty, Mr. Pritchard. Your hands smell of your profession, not of murder." The relief that transformed his weathered features was profound. "I never thought they'd look to the like of me for a lady's death," he said awkwardly, and Miss Marple's response carried the warmth that had made her beloved in St. Mary Mead. "It is precisely to people like you that villages owe their peace." Julian Whitstable's interview proved revelatory in ways that cast his mother's final weeks in an entirely different light. Standing by the mantelpiece where his mother's portrait watched with the detachment that oils afford the dead, he listened without interruptions. Inspector Merryweather explained the findings. When he spoke, it was with a voice no longer carrying the brittle charm Wickham Common had learned to expect. "I have been a selfish fool, Inspector," he admitted, "but I am not a murderer, and it seems very little to accept consequences in the face of what others have borne." His revelation about the will surprised everyone present, Rather than disinheriting him out of spite, Mrs. Whitstable had been establishing a foundation for children who had suffered institutional abuse, planning to announce it after Easter once the legal arrangements were complete. Miss Blake's resolution and the truth about Sylvia Dale. The most delicate conversation fell to Miss Marple herself, conducted in the quiet of the schoolhouse where colored paper eggs still hung from strings that sagged slightly in the middle. Iris Blake, Sylvia Dale, stood at the chalkboard, looking out at the small desks as if measuring them against a memory of herself much smaller and more frightened. "It was not justice I wanted," she said before Miss Marple could begin, "or not the sort that includes prisons and headlines. I wanted someone to say it was wrong and I should have made it right. I wanted not to feel mad for remembering." Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that memory could cut as surely as any blade, took her hand with genuine compassion. "You are not mad, and you will not be compelled to stand in public to prove it. There will be an acknowledgment in the parish records, properly entered with facts stated without sensation. The vicar is a kind man who will insist upon it." The psychological landscape of the tragedy became clearer through this conversation. Mrs. Penfold had killed not to protect herself from exposure, but to silence the voice that reminded her daily of her complicity in a child's suffering. Her guilt had festered for 30 years, transforming helpful service into a form of penance and eventually into something far more desperate. The technical resolution. In the library at Hazeldown, Miss Marple laid out the complete pattern of the crime for Inspector Merryweather's records. The poison had been prussic acid extracted from apricot kernels using an old household recipe, not stolen from Mr. Pettigrew's shop. The scent was masked by sweet almond essence and heliotrope talc. The fatal cone had been selected for its darker ribbon, deliberately repositioned and tied with the practical reef knot that Mrs. Penfold habitually used. A knot that would hold under stress, unlike the decorative bows preferred by most village ladies. The double coating had been accomplished on the parish room's gas hob, leaving the telltale scorch mark and scattered sugar grains that had first caught Miss Marple's attention. The amethyst bead from Mrs. Penfold's rosary, not a necklace, had been used to test whether the sweet almond essence would successfully mask the bitter scent of the poison. The threatening letters and telephone calls were genuine expressions of Miss Blake's need for acknowledgement, Miss Marple explained. But when Mrs. Whitstable refused to apologize or even acknowledge the harm done, Mrs. Penfold's long-suppressed guilt hardened into a terrible resolution. She used her position as helpful organizer to ensure Mrs. Whitstable selected the poison cone, even commenting on how lovely the ribbons looked to draw attention to that area of the display. Community healing and reflection. Conrad Fielding departed Wickham Common with his notebook closed, having decided to write about responsibility and the peculiar English habit of hiding heroism in acknowledged mistakes rather than pursuing the scandal he had originally sought. His conversation with Miss Marple had convinced him that some stories were too human for sensational treatment. The parish room's gas hob was scoured until its tiny crescent scar disappeared beneath a new iron ring that would, in time, be forgotten under the clatter of urns and the steam of ordinary tea. The darker ribbon, of which several lengths remained, was quietly repurposed by Miss Blake for classroom use. Children, in their wisdom, caring little if a bough was duller than it might be, so long as it held secure. On the Sunday following Mrs. Penfold's arrest, Wickham Common gathered in a church that smelled of born flowers and beeswax. The vicar preached not on sin, but on stewardship, of children, of truth, of the small duties by which communities maintain faith with themselves. He named no names because he needed to name none. People wept and then sang, their voices unsteady at first, but growing stronger as they found their harmony again. Miss Marple's departure and final reflections. On her final evening in Wickham Common, Miss Marple sat with Emmeline by the cottage window, while the lane beyond softened into violet twilight. The blue wool lay in her lap, and she wound it with the contentment that follows finished work. "I suppose you knew from the first," Emmeline ventured, though she didn't quite believe her own assertion. From the first? Miss Marple smiled gently. No, my dear, I had only that little feeling one gets when something is too convenient, too tidy. Helpful women can be terrible tempters to tidiness, Emmeline. They like to make bad things neat. But Mrs. Penfold's neatness had sharp edges that scratched one's fingers if examined too closely. And then there was the knot. The knot? A reef knot where a bow should be, Miss Marple explained. Sailors tie them, and nurses, and schoolmistresses who must keep packages secure. It's a very reliable knot that tells you the person using it expects strain. Villagers usually prefer bows. They're very fond of appearances. The following morning, Miss Marple took her leave of Wickham Common. The road ran between hedges thick with cow parsley, and in the distance, church bells were being rung in fits and starts by inexperienced hands as the community slowly learned to live with what had happened and with one another. Miss Marple looked back once, because it was polite to do so, and because she had grown fond of places where truth had been successfully coaxed into the light. She thought of Mrs. Whitstable, whose virtues had been genuine though armoured in class and habit. Of Mrs. Penfold, whose guilt had become its own destructive god. Of Miss Blake, who would teach children to be both brave and kind. And of Inspector Merryweather, who would add this case to his understanding of the extraordinary things ordinary people could do when pressed beyond their limits. It is always human nature, she said aloud, as one might comment on the weather. One must simply be patient enough to knit it into a pattern one recognizes. The bus rounded the corner, and she climbed aboard with the ease of an elderly lady who knew where steps were smooth. As Wickham Common receded into the green countryside, it remained no less itself for what it had endured, and perhaps a touch more honest about sorrow, kindness, and the sharp edges that even the prettiest ribbons could conceal. In villages, as in human hearts, the most dangerous secrets were often hidden beneath the most helpful facades. But truth, like spring growth, had a way of pushing through even the most carefully maintained surfaces when the time was right. The mystery of Mrs. Whitstable's murder was solved, but its deeper lessons about guilt, responsibility, and the long shadows cast by old wrongs would linger in Wickham Common long after the chalk marks had faded from the lawn and life had resumed its familiar rhythms. The weight of Mrs. Penfold's confession settled over the parish room like dust after a great disturbance, and in the silence that followed her departure with Inspector Merryweather, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of those who remained. The revelation had shattered more than just the case. It had fractured the fundamental assumptions upon which Wickham Common had built its sense of safety and community trust. Reverend Penfold arrived within the hour, summoned by a constable whose awkward delivery of the news had left the vicar standing in his garden with pruning shears still in hand, staring at the roses his wife had tended so carefully that very morning. His entrance into the parish room carried the particular dignity of a man who understood that his personal grief must be set aside in service of his pastoral duties, though Miss Marple observed the way his hands trembled slightly as he surveyed the space where his wife had planned and executed her sophisticated crime. "I must ask your forgiveness," he said quietly to the assembled group, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Not for crimes I did not commit, but for the blindness that allowed them to be conceived under my own roof. A shepherd who cannot see the wolves among his flock has failed in his most fundamental duty." Miss Marple approached him with the gentle authority that had served her well in moments of crisis. "Reverend Penfold, guilt is not always visible to those who live closest to it. Your wife's deception was remarkable in its sophistication precisely because it built upon genuine helpfulness and years of trusted service. Even the most observant among us might have been deceived." The afternoon brought a steady stream of villagers to the parish room, drawn by the inexorable pull of communal crisis. Each arrival brought fresh shock as the details of Mrs. Penfold's confession spread through Wickham Common with the particular speed reserved for news that challenged everything people thought they knew about their neighbors. Mrs. Finch from the post office arrived with eyes red from weeping, clutching a handkerchief and speaking in broken sentences about the telephone calls she had witnessed, the letters she had handled, never suspecting their true significance. Miss Blake appeared near evening, her school mistress composure intact, but her eyes carrying the complex mixture of vindication and sorrow that comes when long-sought justice arrives at such a terrible price. She moved through the room with quiet purpose, offering comfort to those who struggled to reconcile the helpful Mrs. Penfold they had known with the calculating murderer she had proven to be. "I never wanted this," she said to Miss Marple as they stood together near the window where the last light of day fell across the gas hob that had served such dark purposes. "I wanted acknowledgement, perhaps an apology, but never this. The knowledge that my persistence drove her to such desperate measures will be its own burden to carry." Miss Marple's response carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many such moments when justice and tragedy intertwined in uncomfortable ways. "My dear, you cannot take responsibility for another person's choice to commit murder. Mrs. Penfold's guilt had festered for 30 years before you returned to Wickham Common. Your courage in seeking truth may have precipitated the crisis, but it did not create the conditions that made such a crisis possible." Julian Whitstable arrived as the shadows began to lengthen, his usual polished appearance replaced by something more genuine and infinitely more fragile. The revelation of his mother's true intentions regarding the will had stripped away the last vestiges of his carefully maintained charm, leaving him to grapple with the realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood both his mother's character and his own circumstances. "Inspector Merriweather explained about Mother's foundation," he said, his voice carrying a quality Miss Marple had never heard from him before. Genuine humility touched by grief. "All this time I thought she was punishing me for my failures when she was actually trying to create something meaningful from the family fortune. I have been such a fool." The evening brought Conrad Fielding to the parish room, his journalist's notebook closed for perhaps the first time since his arrival in Wickham Common. His conversation with Miss Marple revealed a man whose professional instincts had been tempered by witnessing the human cost of the story he had come to investigate. "I came here seeking a scandal about wartime charity corruption," he admitted, his usual professional confidence replaced by something more thoughtful. "Instead, I found a tragedy about guilt and the terrible things it can drive people to do when left to fester in darkness. There's a story here, but not the one I expected to write." Miss Marple's examination of the parish room in the fading light revealed details that would complete the technical understanding of Mrs. Penfold's crime. The gas hob bore not just the crescent-shaped scorch mark they had noted earlier, but also tiny scratches where a small drill bit had been cleaned, evidence of the precision tools used to create the hole in the fatal almond. Behind the tea canister, she discovered a fragment of apricot shell, confirmation that the poison had indeed been extracted using the old household method Mrs. Penfold had confessed to employing. Most significantly, caught in the hinge of a cupboard door was a thread of dark blue ribbon that matched perfectly with the material used to retie the fatal cone. The thread showed signs of having been pulled taut under considerable pressure, suggesting that Mrs. Penfold's hands had not been entirely steady during the crucial moments of her crime's execution. As the community began the long process of coming to terms with what had happened, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious psychology of village life. The intimacy that made such communities so rich with connection and mutual support could also create the conditions for elaborate deceptions and long-festering resentments. Mrs. Penfold's position as the helpful organizer had given her access to every aspect of community life, making her invisible in plain sight, while she planned and executed her sophisticated revenge. The church bells struck 8 as the last of the day's visitors departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with Emmeline and the accumulated weight of revelation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Wickham Common began the difficult work of rebuilding trust and processing the knowledge that even the most helpful and familiar faces could conceal depths of desperation capable of blooming into deadly action. "Emmeline," Miss Marple said quietly, as they prepared to leave the parish room that had been the scene of so much innocent activity and such calculated evil. "I find myself thinking about the nature of guilt and how it can transform even the most generous impulses into something quite different." Mrs. Penfold began with the desire to help a frightened child, but when that help proved inadequate, the guilt consumed her until it became something else entirely. A need for vindication that could only be satisfied through the silencing of conscience itself. The evening air carried the scent of primroses and the promise of continued spring growth as they walked through the village where ordinary life would eventually resume, forever changed by the knowledge that murder could be planned with parish room implements and hidden beneath the most helpful of facades. The mystery of Mrs. Whitstable's death was solved, but its deeper lessons about the long shadows cast by old wrongs and the terrible alchemy by which guilt could transform into something deadly would linger in Wickham Common long after the immediate shock had faded. Miss Marple wound her blue wool with characteristic patience as they reached Emmeline's cottage, her mind already turning toward the journey home to St. Mary Mead that would come with tomorrow's dawn. The pattern was complete now, every thread accounted for, every knot properly tied. But the human cost of that completion would require far more time to fully comprehend, and the healing that must follow would demand the patient work of an entire community learning to trust again in the wake of such profound betrayal. The days following Mrs. Penfold's confession settled over Wickham Common with the particular quietness that follows great revelations, when familiar landscapes appear somehow more substantial, as if truth had given weight to things previously taken for granted. The village moved through its morning routines with the careful deliberation of people reassessing everything they thought they knew about their neighbors, finding comfort in the ordinary rituals of post and baker's rounds, while processing the extraordinary knowledge that murder had been planned beneath the most helpful of facades. The formal resolution. The inquest was held on a grey morning when the sky hung low over Wickham Common, muting the colours of the hedgerows and lending the proceedings the sombre dignity they required. The coroner's court filled with villagers who understood that the business of judgment required their witness, though they sat with the hushed attention of people who had learned that sensation was less important than truth carefully established. Dr. Aldridge's testimony was precise and unembellished, laying out the medical evidence of cyanide poisoning with professional clarity. Mr. Pettigrew, nervous but determined, explained the technical aspects of proper confectionery work and what the fatal almond's double coating had revealed about sophisticated tempering. Inspector Merriweather presented his evidence methodically, the thread of dark ribbon, the scorch mark on the parish room hob, the scattered sugar grains, the amethyst bead with its telltale residue, like stepping stones across a stream that everyone, reluctantly, had to cross. Mrs. Penfold's formal confession, given in the presence of her solicitor, filled in the remaining technical details with the methodical precision of someone finally unburdening herself of a terrible secret. She had prepared the poison over several evenings using her grandmother's recipe for extracting prussic acid from apricot kernels, tested the scent masking on her rosary bead, and practiced the ribbon substitution during legitimate parish activities. The jury returned their verdict without drama because the accumulated evidence had made it inevitable, and the case proceeded to the higher court, where justice would take its measured course. Individual reckonings. Reverend Penfold bore his burden with the quiet dignity that had always characterized his ministry, though Miss Marple observed how the empty vicarage rooms seemed to echo with a solitude that was both profound and, in its own way, healing. His sermons took on new depth, speaking not of abstract good and evil, but of the very real complexities of forgiveness and the long shadows cast by unaddressed guilt. When he removed his wife's name from the church committee lists, it was done without anger but with sorrowful resolution that conveyed the full weight of her betrayal. At Hazeldown, Julian Whitstable began the careful work of rebuilding both estate and character. The revelation of his mother's true intentions regarding the foundation had stripped away his last vestiges of superficial charm, leaving him to grapple with the recognition that he had fundamentally misunderstood both her character and his own circumstances. His meeting with the family solicitor revealed the full scope of Mrs. Whitstable's plans. She had been corresponding with former evacuees for months, gathering information for a comprehensive report on institutional failures and offering concrete assistance rather than mere apologies. Mother was trying to create something meaningful from past mistakes, Julian explained to Miss Marple during her final visit to Hazeldown. Not redemption, perhaps, but continuation. If one must inherit a fortune, it seems proper to point it towards something that mends rather than merely maintains. Miss Blake found her vindication tempered by the recognition that her pursuit of acknowledgement had precipitated events far more serious than she had intended. The truth about Sylvia Dale was formally entered into the parish records, a small but significant act of historical rectification that provided the acknowledgement she had sought. Her teaching took on new purpose as she worked with Julian to develop the Foundation's educational outreach, a quiet partnership forming from their shared understanding of institutional failure and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. Community healing. The village itself began the delicate work of processing what had happened, finding that betrayal from such a trusted source required careful examination of all their assumptions about helpfulness and hidden motivations. Mrs. Finch at the post office spoke for many when she observed that Mrs. Penfold's constant availability for every committee and crisis had made her invisible in plain sight, the perfect position from which to plan and execute sophisticated deception. Tom Pritchard returned to his gardens with quiet dignity, his vindication complete but his understanding of human nature forever altered. He performed his own small ritual of closure by trimming the yew path where the garden party had taken place, finding beneath one shrub a scrap of the darker ribbon that he quietly consigned to his burning barrel. When Miss Marple encountered him by the garden gate, she observed how carefully he had shaped the path's edges and remarked simply, "Neatness where it belongs, Mr. Pritchard, is a comfort." Conrad Fielding lingered another day, walking the lanes without his notebook as if seeing Wickham Common required eyes unencumbered by professional intention. His eventual article would focus not on scandal, but on responsibility and the ways villages carry their burdens through people who rarely speak of them. "I came seeking corruption," he told Miss Marple, "but found instead a tragedy about guilt and the terrible transformations it can work when left to fester in darkness." Miss Marple's departure. On her final morning, Miss Marple made one last visit to the parish room, now scrubbed clean of its associations with sophisticated crime. The gas hob stood innocently in its corner, its telltale scorch mark polished away, and the familiar scents of beeswax and lavender had replaced the ghostly traces of bitter almond and heliotrope that had revealed so much about careful preparation and desperate concealment. "It is always human nature, Emmeline," she reflected as they shared their final cup of tea together. "The kindness and the cruelty, the courage and the cowardice, all woven together in patterns that remain invisible until the final thread is drawn. Mrs. Penfold was not naturally wicked, but guilt can transform even the most generous impulses when it is allowed to consume rather than instruct." The morning bus arrived with its customary rattle and faint smell of oil and damp tickets. Miss Marple climbed aboard with careful steps, settling into a seat that looked out on hedges bright with new green. As Wickham Common fell away behind her, she observed the enduring landmarks, the church spire reaching toward heaven, the schoolhouse where dark ribbon was being turned to gentler purposes, the gardens where Tom Pritchard would continue his patient work with runner beans and roses. Final reflection. The mystery of Mrs. Whitstable's murder was solved, but its deeper lessons would linger in Wickham Common long after the immediate shock had faded. The village had learned that betrayal could emerge from the most trusted sources, that helpfulness could mask the most sophisticated deceptions, and that the past, however carefully buried, possessed an uncomfortable tendency to demand acknowledgement in the present. Miss Marple wound her blue wool with the satisfaction of work properly completed, thinking not of the cleverness of the crime, but of the ordinary things that had undone it. A knot too practical for a celebration, a scent too refined to be innocent, a bead with sugar crystallized in its heart. Human nature, she reflected, was ultimately a domestic thing, and its puzzles, however grave, were worked from familiar threads. One must not be grand about such matters. The most sophisticated criminals still left traces of their passage through the world of ordinary objects and everyday relationships. As the bus carried her toward St. Mary Mead and the familiar rhythms of her own village life, Miss Marple reflected that Wickham Common would continue, slightly altered in its angles perhaps, but sound in its fundamental structure. The soil there was rich with history and human complexity, and while it had produced one terrible harvest, it would undoubtedly continue to nurture the quieter crops of community life, mutual support, and the patient work of people learning to trust again in the wake of profound betrayal. The Easter garden party that had begun in celebration and ended in tragedy would be remembered not for its horror, but for the way truth had eventually emerged through careful observation and patient persistence. In villages, as in human hearts, the most dangerous secrets were often hidden beneath the most helpful facades. But justice, like spring growth, possessed its own inexorable power to push through even the most carefully maintained surfaces when the time was right.